I wanted to, first of all, explore building apps for mobile. I've never done it, so that was one thing I wanted to do. And I had already been, doing stuff with Clojure for a while, and I was curious actually just how much of an app can you write with Clojure or actually ClojureScript. And I started exploring that, and so there's so if you're writing for Android, there's somebody writing a Clojure app, I think, over the Android SDK. And I may have heard of someone writing a Clojure compiler for Objective-C. And so there are options. So the way that I went about it is that I set it up with Cordova and ClojureScript, and I'm going to talk about how that all works if you're not familiar with that. So if you've got just your basic mobile app, you've got your native app, and you use the SDK to write it, right? And one of the UI elements that's offered by all these, by Android, iOS, is a browser widget, right? And this browser widget is a UI element. You package your web resources into it, and then you can present it to the user. And so you can build your user interface in this widget, and you can execute JavaScript in this widget. And so that is on iOS, on the iPhone. It is kind of like having mobile Safari, but without JIT. Yes.
With iOS 8, that's not true anymore.
Right. I saw that. Yeah, thank you. I saw David Nolan post that. Yeah.
It's not a widget, it's a window.
It's a window?
Yeah, browser.
Okay, cool. So it's a thing that lets you load web pages, as far as I'm concerned. So you could also potentially load a remote website, and theoretically you could maybe even update that portion of your app if Apple approves your app with that functionality. And I don't know if you can trust the internet, but somebody wrote that they got an app like that approved. But that's probably not something you can consistently expect to be able to do. So where Cordova comes in, it's basically a bridge. It's an Apache open source project. You may have also heard of PhoneGap. They are analogous. They're like Chrome and Chromium. I think that's the relationship. And so it's like a bridge between the JavaScript that's running in your UI web view. That would be the iOS version of a web window. And that is the bridge, and it provides a uniform JavaScript API, and then it provides implementations for the respective platforms. So you have an Objective-C implementation, an Android implementation, Java, etc. And you have a mechanism by which you can actually call native code from your JavaScript, and vice versa, and you can get return value. I don't know that exact mechanism. I believe it has something to do with the URL string in the UI web view. And the reason I don't know about it is because Cordova takes care of all of that. And they provide basically APIs that do all of these things. So if you need to do any of this stuff, there's an API, and you can call it from JavaScript. You can pass a callback, and you can get a return value in your JavaScript callback from in this case would be Objective-C or whatever the native thing is. And so the way Cordova then bundles your app, it takes your resources, and it'll then build the respective native apps, right? So it'll wrap them in the respective UI web views and these other platforms that are supported. I didn't really do anything except iOS, so I'm not sure if it's really very feasible to use it to sort of write code once and run it on all those platforms, because there are a lot of sort of stumbling blocks with that. So I don't think that's really something you can expect. But there's a portion of your code that could potentially be reusable. So the limitations are that it's basically the lowest common denominator. The API that comes with Cordova is just the lowest common denominator of the functionality that is provided by the various platforms. So it would probably be insufficient if you were doing something, that was slightly more sophisticated. So just for example, the problem that I ran into with my project was that the media API from Cordova lets you play back and record audio, but you cannot access the music on your iPhone that is part of your iPod music. So another problem, for example, that I had, so the AV audio recorder class there, it can provide, it has these methods for recording for a specified amount of time or starting recording at a specific point in time, and all you get with Cordova is just a generic record. So if you need, sort of again, if you get outside those boundaries, you need to do custom plugins. And luckily Cordova provides a way to do that, and it's very straightforward. So that same asynchronous messaging system that they use to implement their plugins, those APIs, you basically have access to it. And all you got to do is write the JavaScript and some native code portions of your plugin, and you have your own plugin.
It's actually synchronous.
Is it synchronous?
Yeah, the threading. I mean, 4 years ago I worked for a company where we built almost exactly the same thing as Cordova, but for in-app advertising. So you can have like the actual advertising in the JavaScript web UI view layer, and then you would take a native SDK and embed that into your application. And the way that the synchronization works is that it's really wacky because iOS and Android allow you to inject JavaScript into like the UI web view window. It doesn't necessarily give you the actual like synchronous result back. So you actually have to get into these funky callback loops where it's like you inject, you as the native side on Objective-C call to execute something in the JavaScript interpreter in the window. It then calls back into the Objective-C side of things to give a return result via the protocol handler mechanism support you mentioned before, where the URL, when you invoke a URL, a custom URL, on the native side, you get like a callback on that in Objective-C. So like the entire like threading piece on it is very, very quirky.
Okay. Well, I guess that's why I use Cordova to just take care of that.
4 years ago, or
Is there a lot of plugins publicly available?
Yeah, they've just started producing them. There's a repository of plugins that exists. They're kind of still very basic, nothing, but there might be something.
Obvious place for people.
Yeah, there's definitely. Yeah, it's still a very young project, I would say, right? So as the versions of Cordova were getting updated, my stuff just kept breaking, and I spent a lot of time, just patching up Cordova, really. Well, I don't know if I would post a question, and then nobody would answer it. Then I would answer my own question, and then that change would make it into Cordova. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence or.
You're doing all the work for.
So yeah, so you can. So Cordova lets you get values back from Objective-C functions in your JavaScript callbacks. And these are the different value types that you can get. And Cordova handles the conversion between JavaScript and the native data type. So there are also limitations on when you go into background mode, JavaScript freezes. So if you got something going on that has to finish, like even if you go into background mode on iOS, you can request like an extra 3 minutes to complete things, like if you're writing user data or something like that. And so if you want to do something like that, the Cordova File API does not provide this protection. So you'd want to do a custom plugin if you were doing something like that. So I think if you were doing something like in the real world, you'd probably end up writing a lot of custom plugins, but it's fairly straightforward to do that, so I don't think that's like such a big annoyance. And you can just keep them minimal and do as much as you can in JavaScript or rather ClojureScript. And certain kinds of apps also are allowed by Apple to run in the background indefinitely, but you got to be a specific kind of app and you got to declare that For example, something that plays audible content, that's got to be able to run indefinitely in the background. So if you got anything like that, that should also be delegated, that kind of functionality, to a plugin to the native side. All right, so now I want to talk about how ClojureScript fit into the picture for me, just the basic building blocks that I used. Yeah, I'm not going to talk so much about my app. It's not really about the app. It's just about the architecture of the app and how one might go about doing something like this. So core async is a huge help with handling, first of all these APIs. The Cordova APIs are callback APIs. So with core async, this was one of the things I wanted to learn, and I used this project to sort of get familiar with core async. So it's really helpful in handling the callback APIs. And also, when you're getting the touch input from the user, it's very helpful for doing that. Rather than, again, having callbacks fire all over the place, you just put things on channels. And the other sort of big win, in my view, is the OM library that David Nolan wrote for doing user interfaces in JavaScript. And of course, you get the REPL. And I want to talk about this client-server setup that I got going on that just kind of makes development a little bit smoother. So when I'm developing, I've got my native app running on the phone, that's on the left, and I just package an index.html in there, and all it does, it just redirects to a web server running on my development machine that serves up that whole website, right? And then anytime I want to update it, I just update the files on my development machine, and I just reload the browser widget from the REPL. Or another thing I do is I'll just somewhere in the browser widget have a little place like a refresh button that I can just refresh. So that just, if you didn't do that, you'd have to, every time you make a little change in your JavaScript or HTML, you gotta repackage, you recompile and repackage the app in Xcode, and it's a little bit annoying to have to do that all the time. I found that light table was the most stable in connecting to the browser window running on the phone. And if you have any changes that you have to make to native code, obviously you still have to recompile and rerun. So this is how I used core async to handle API calls. This is, if you're not familiar with core async, this is just a very sort of brief intro to how you would do that. So on top is just the sort of the regular setup. You have your API call, you get a callback, and it fires when it fires. You don't have any control over when it fires. And on the bottom is what you do is you have your same API call, and then what you do in the callback that you pass in, all that callback does is just put the value on the core async channel. And then you can do this sort of parking read, and you can basically read from the channel whenever you want to, so you're kind of back in control now. And you don't have the logic of your program spread all over the callback. So that made it really neat, and just made it a lot easier to think about things. So this is just an example of how I used core async. I don't know if this is really the best way to do things, so I'm actually curious what, if I'm doing something funky here. But so for example, I'm trying to get here on the left side, the function getFS is just attempting to get to the file system, and we're using the Cordova API request file system right there to ask for it. And over here we're going to put that value on a channel, which we've declared here in the let, and the whole thing is in a go block, which the go block will immediately return a channel, and then when the request file system gets us back a value, we'll put it back in the channel, and we read it off that channel right on the very bottom, so that the thing that calls getFS will get a channel which will eventually contain the file system that was returned by request file system. And so the function on the right now will use the function on the left, getFS. Again, it has to be inside a go block, because we're now in kind of the async world. And inside the let on the right there, we call getFS, and we bind it to fs. But we first have to read off of it, because getFS again gives us back a channel, not the actual value, but the channel will contain the value when it gets there. And so now this looks a little bit more like sort of your synchronous code, just except you have to read off a channel rather than, you know, directly get the value. And so you can kind of chain these functions more easily this way. Okay, the other thing that core async is really useful for is handling touch input. This is a very common pattern that, you know, I've seen people use. Is just again, whenever there's any kind of a touch event, you just put it on the channel, and then you can get a loop going where you read this channel, and you just process these input values. I just want to show you. It's just a big ass loop, really. I'm not going to show you. It's going to take too long. I changed my mind. No, because I got to figure out how to adjust the font and all that.
You have to go back to slide view or something.
Yeah, no, it's just frozen now.
Oh, sorry.
Let's continue like this. I don't know what's going on.
Hit the
player there. The top right.
Top right?
We're right next to it now. The play button.
It's green.
I thought you said top right. Okay, thank you very much. Whoever helped me out, and I was just listening, not looking. Right, so I'm not going to show you. But now for building the user interface, so if you were doing things this way, you would not be using the native SDK to build the user interface. You might consider using React and Node. I'm going to show you. It's very basic and simple, just how to do touch gesture detection, right? Because now you don't have, in the gesture detection, you have to write that in JavaScript or ClojureScript. But before I get to that, I just want to mention that you get very fluid transitions with CSS5 transitions if you use Translate 3D rather than the 2D version, and it's faster, as I discovered on the internet, due to hardware acceleration.
But only on the iPhone.
Only on the iPhone, okay.
If you try that on Android,
Okay. So this is one of those points where you're not going to be able to use things across. Yeah. So there's a lot of things like that where things break down. So.
For the React piece, is that actually pulled directly from Facebook's servers, or is it like?
Well, no. You pull in OM, but just in case people were not familiar with React, I just wanted to mention that it's all
right,
built
the
on
actual
React.
code itself, so if you like just storing it locally on the device, or are you doing like a real-time poll like you mentioned before?
No. I store it locally. I don't know why. Right. So that only works on the iPhone apparently. Yeah, I did this on the iPhone. I did not do this across because I have an iPhone, so that's what's easier for me. And I just want to also mention that you can present the native UI views if you want to. You can, and if it's convenient to do so. For example, in my case, I had to access the music. And there's already a sort of this thing, MP Media Picker controller, that, you know, it presents a nice view of all your music organized, and then the user just picks and you get it. So I just used it, and you can do that.
Through Cordova, right?
Yeah, you do it still through Cordova. So it's just another plugin. It's just another JavaScript function call to that view. That view pops up. You select whatever. That view disappears. You back to your window. All right, touch and gesture detection. So in JavaScript, you've got the three basic touch events that you get: touch start, touch move, touch end, and you build your gesture detection on top of that. I'm not going to show you, but if I can do it, you can do it. So the other sort of really helpful piece for building the user interface is OM. And React, if you're not familiar, I will briefly mention what these things are. So React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces built by Facebook. Some folks at Facebook. It's really cool. It just periodically re-renders the DOM at like a certain interval, and it just bashes the writes to the DOM, right? Because they're expensive, and so it keeps this virtual DOM, and then anytime it wants to make an update, it just calculates a minimal update path, and it tries to optimize things that way. And Pete Hunt, who's a fellow that I found on the internet who talks a lot about React.js, so I assume he's really involved with the project. He says they can get 60 frames per second on a non-JIT phone. And see, this is proof that I knew about iOS 8 having JIT. And I'm going to let David Nolan speak about what OM is. So I copied here from GitHub. OM allows users to represent their UI simply as Eden. So you basically have an atom with your app state, and that represents your whole UI. And then because ClojureScript data is immutable, OM can always rapidly re-render the UI from the root. Thus, OM UIs are out of the box snapshotable and undoable. And for me, that was the really cool part, because it simplifies testing and debugging, and you get undo kind of for free. So that's really neat. I hear it's really hard to do, actually, and I never tried, but I believe the people who say that. If you want to find out more, you should check out David Nolan's blog. I think this is really cool. If you're doing user interfaces, you might want to be aware of it if you're not already. And it's really declarative. So that's what makes it really neat. I did want to show you an OM component. Let me see if I can manage to adjust the fonts after all. I'm just always afraid to go into the preferences.
I don't remember that once upon a time you could command plus and it would just make them bigger in IntelliJ.
Let's see.
Some point you just
Bam. Okay, so this is the loop that I wanted to show you earlier. Oh, damn. Right? So you have this UI chain, and all the things, all the inputs basically, all the things that the user does, they go on that channel, and then you have this go loop that's constantly reading from the channel, and it's just processing the various things that come in, and it's all here in this one loop. And you know, if you want to figure things out, it's all in one place. It's nice and neat. And let me see if I can find a.
I think there was something below that.
Let's see if I can find a. I seem to have misplaced my OM component. Here it is. So this is just a quick example of an OM component. Menu item, that's an OM component. And the way you do it is you basically implement a bunch of protocols, and that gets you a component. So init state, that's your initial state. In this case, we just have a channel here. That's just, you're going to have access to the channel throughout the life cycle, if I understand correctly, of this component. Right? And I will mount, that's another protocol that you implement. And what we're doing here is we're getting that channel that we declared here. And then we pass that channel to a function that I wrote. That's the one that detects gestures. It takes a channel, And then when it happens to detect a gesture, it just puts it on the UI chain. Right? So that's how you would wire up the touch events, detection of touch events on your component. So it's all right here in one spot. And then this is kind of the iRender state, or iRender, depending if there's state or not. That is the meat and potatoes of the library. That is how you render actual components. And so the way you do it, you don't have like a templating language. You just use ClojureScript, which is, I think, better, unless you need to kind of, I don't know, I've been doing it that way, and it feels better to me personally. I don't know if you'd like it. But, and so here's how you wire that up. And it's all right here, and you can have components inside of components, and then you can and then you do something like what I'm doing here to build components consisting of multiple other components, etc., etc. All right, so these are, as I see them, just the basic trade-offs. You know, the obvious pros are you get Clojure semantics, and that's really cool. You know, the UI is in JavaScript, HTML, CSS. That is either a pro or a con, depending on your point of view. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't build a lot of user interfaces. It's probably powerful, but probably has limitations. And I think a big win could be if you have something on the server side that's talking to your app, to have Clojure and even, you know, doing that. I think that can give you a lot of leverage. The cons might be that it's not as performant, so maybe if you need to squeeze every last ounce out of your app, you might not want to go this route. Maybe your UI cannot be as rich, I don't know, and it's a little bit more complex. That's all I got. Thanks, guys. Yes, please, questions.
What was your sense of the performance drop-off against native?
I did not. I had a very basic app. I did. So I'll tell you the kind of things I did. I picked a song from the iPhone library. I created a waveform that would run as the song would play. There was no performance drop-off. Everything was for simple things like that. You don't feel any difference. It feels just like, yeah. I tried. I really tried. Yeah. I tested. Yes, please.
So suppose you wanted to use a native interface, like use the UI of this view or something like one of the Cocoa interfaces.
Right.
Do you think you could just be like, could JS control? Could we move all the logic in Clojure and
yes.
JS
Yes.
do that?
You could do that.
That would actually work.
You could do that. Yeah. Because if you can get the one UI element, you can get at any of them. My first answer is yeah, you could wire it up that way. It would be a little tricky, but I think you could do it.
There's actually a JavaScript binding, a direct binding between just JavaScript, no UI, but hero stuff, and Objective-C. So what you can do is from JavaScript directly call Objective-C calls, and from Objective-C back to JavaScript. And if you take an object, let's say a JavaScript object like an array, and you put it on the bridge, it will be converted into a JS value in Objective-C, and then you can use it there like an array. So that would actually allow you to run ClojureScript.
I saw that bridge, but the interface, the API, you have to build each one in Objective-C. Yeah. So who wants to write all that Objective-C? Right? I mean, who wants to do it for me? I can include it.
But to answer your question, the performance is significantly slower.
Oh,
so it's significantly. And the other thing is for your cons, the debugging is testing.
For what?
Debugging and testing.
Oh.
Is a nightmare.
Oh, really?
Well, I didn't do anything very complex, and I didn't find it more difficult than, say, doing it purely in Xcode, but maybe if things get more complex, I could see that being more of an, becoming more and more of an issue.
On the Android side, the testing is a nightmare.
Okay. Yeah.
So you sort of reconvinced me again, a decision I made a couple years ago to just go with HTML5 and not worry about, complying with iOS and Android. So running through two different things. I used to do a lot of and Adobe Flex Air development, which was sort of a precursor to Adobe and Adobe Bot and Adobe. Their HTML5 is very rapidly moving technology, and it has built into it like WebSockets and stuff where you can have very fast bidirectional transfer of data. Have you thought about integrating that in your?
I have not thought about that at all, but I will think about it in the future.
That's part of the problem with doing this is that like the actual web view itself doesn't support a lot of that. So don't assume that the actual like web view is like mobile Safari or Chrome or anything like that. And on Android, the actual web view that you get up until about 4.4.3 is actually like 4 years old. They completely atrophy support for it, and then in 4.2, you actually get a Chromium window, and they actually do it by a web view provider API, so they gutted the whole thing. So that's why I was saying before about the testing is just a nightmare, because on Android, you never know what kind of browser you're getting. You can get Chromium, you can get Chrome, you can get the old web view, or you can get Firefox if you want. So, and all of them implement those HTML5 standards differently, or not at all, on their mobile. So,
You got all that?
What you just said sounds to me completely the antithesis of what HTML5 is all about. I mean,
welcome to.
Well,
Doesn't the Clojure compiler from Google remove some of that because it makes it gives you a single point of entry to the different JavaScript implementation in the different browsers, so you don't have to install all of that anymore?
Well, but you're assuming that they take into account the actual web view itself, which is different from the actual browser.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And then also you have to take into account all the versioning, right? So it's like you have to look at the Android side of things. You have to look at what's the major rev, what's the minor rev, because like Google's quality control in general on Android is atrocious. For Cordova's piece, it actually broke completely in 2.3 because they used to actually inject Java objects directly into the JavaScript VM context. You can't do that. You can't do it on iOS, but you know Objective-C does allow you to do it. You could do it on the Java side of things for Android. You used to be able to say for your injected Java object into JavaScript, just call a method on it until like Google forgot that they broke it in 2.3, so the entire major rev version stops, and every single Cordova app or anything that uses the same technology completely stopped working.
So those would be the risks.
So now the way that it works actually now is that it's the callback when we were talking about the synchronicity.
Right, right.
When it actually has to go through on the native side into the JavaScript context, it's actually going through the message pop-up. It captures it, traps it on the JavaScript side and says, is the message that you're passing back like one of our control APIs? If so, use the control API. Otherwise, say, hi, I'm here, dismiss kind of thing. Okay. So,
Okay.
it's a
Yes.
moving target.
Have you looked at all, I know no one uses Firefox OS, but it doesn't matter, but it is a JavaScript platform. I was wondering if Cordova supports that at all, and if there is any.
I don't know. I believe they at least plan to support it. They might already support it. I don't know though.
It's just regular like HTML5, teaches everything but almost JavaScript.
So you wouldn't even need this.
You wouldn't even
right?
need it for that.
Huh.
But the 0.003% market share of Firefox devices is tough to swing.
Yeah, no, I get that.
It's an emerging technology.
Yeah, the guy that did J2ME polish,
Back in the old JME days, he's actually a big guy into that now.
Oh, yeah.
That more soft.
What's that?
That might be something that they
Any other questions, folks? Yes.
Push notifications. I don't think you're actually using them, but
I'm not.
Cordova supports it, or no?
You mean the Objective-C notifications that you get?
Yeah. So you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean,
background
or
processing.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So like if your app's not actually running, but it's registered itself as a as receiving could receive
Right.
notifications. then when something comes in,
So you could do
it'll
that.
Spin it up. Yeah.
So you could do that in your plugin. You can receive them, and you can, if you want, put things on the channel as you receive them, to pass it back to JavaScript, ClojureScript land. But remember, it freezes when you go into background mode.
Right.
So that's the. But yeah, you can access that. Yes.
Did you successfully submit an app? Or is it
No, I did not successfully. I got work, so this project stopped.
That's not the risk.
That's another risk, yeah. Yes?
Do you find it like a little bit, I don't know, like onerous or sort of like tiresome to like to set up channels for like every parent component to talk to every child component? I know that like if you have a like more complex.
You're talking about when I did the chaining of the functions that
or like having a or just setting up. I noticed like when I work with I have to set up a lot of channels where parents and components can sort of get information from children.
See, you probably have a bit more experience with OM. See, when I started this project, I saw OM pop up, and I spoke with David, and he said, "Don't, so he said, "Don't do it, and don't touch it." and so I didn't do it with OM, and then I started converting it with OM. This is just one of the first, and so I don't know what it's like to have a lot of OM components. So you probably am better qualified to speak on this. So can't answer that. Yeah.
Coming from the parent, where would you go?
Sorry?
If it's not coming from the parent, then where would you say is the right place to inject other things?
Depending on what information is being updated, maybe you could like have a few channels that are sort of set up at higher levels, I guess, as opposed to having just a new channel getting set up at each level subcomponent, just have one callback go up one level. Another maybe way you can do it is digital file like this, but like pass the entire data, all of the like the app state down as like an option. Like this is like a state patch, like as a extra option hash, and then
You should talk to David. Yeah.
update that way. Sorry.
It's global. You should be able to just reach into it.
Well, I mean, having a separate UI tree is how every other moving system works, right? I forget the word you use, but it's essentially a transaction, right? You start it, you make all your changes at the end of the transaction, you just do a swap.
Mm.
So if, depending on how deep you want to go into the tree, if you had like one at the top, and you can actually pass it all the way down. But I believe the nice thing about it, I haven't done it myself, but I believe the nice thing about it is that it's basically doing diffs all the way down because it's counting on the immutability, as opposed to the regular React.js. It actually has to walk the whole tree because it can't say. Yeah, because it can't say exactly where the change happened.
But you're talking about the event logic, right? Not the reason.
Yeah, I'm talking about sort of like updating the like the main cursor as opposed to like
If you can.
exactly like updating like the main cursor as opposed to
Right. In this case, it's just really front optimization.
The cursors are modeled after zippers, right? But with zippers, you can actually get the whole object from the zipper, as far as I remember. While the cursors, it's not implemented, so it's impossible for a subcursor to actually get the whole operation, like the whole object. So I suppose it's really not meant to have that you are like a smaller component can access the should access the whole.
I just asked Dave about that where you can show us the region if you want.
Yeah.
Yes.
So actually I haven't done any mobile development. I'm curious about the gestures. Is there like two-finger gesture as well implemented? Do you have to build that up?
You have to implement all the gestures yourself that you want. I'm pretty sure pretty soon there's going to be just a JavaScript library that does all this. I looked casually and there wasn't anything that I saw, but it's fairly straightforward. Like I said earlier, I managed to do it like pretty quickly. So. Anyone else? Thank you, guys.